thank you very much for being here today. You are at the webinar, The Growing Need for Renewable Energy in Lebanon, with Rani Alashkar and Joseph Al-Assad as speakers. You know, we, as I said, you know, you will get the slides and the recordings, but this is your chance to ask questions live to our experts. So without further ado, I will let Rani Alashkar start with his presentation. Rani, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rani Al-Ashkar. I'm from the Lebanese Center for Energy Conservation. We will be joined later by Dr. Joseph Al-Assad from the Ministry of Energy and Water and Associate Professor at the Holy Spirit University of Catholic. So I'll start the presentation and later on Dr. Joseph will continue. The presentation will be about the growing renewable energy in Lebanon and the potential for energy storage. This is an outline of the presentation, but I will start with the political commitment. It all started in 2009 at the COP15 in Copenhagen, where the government of Lebanon committed itself to 12% renewable energy by 2020. This commitment was translated into activities within the policy paper for the electricity sector, which was published by the Ministry of Energy and Water in 2020 and 10. This policy paper for the electricity sector confirmed the target and then elaborated on renewable energy activity and demand side management and energy efficiency activities. This led to the publishing by the LCEC, by the Lebanese Center for Energy Conservation in 2011 of the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan for Lebanon. This was the first NEAP, the first National Energy Efficiency Action Plan. It was adopted by the Ministry of Energy and Water and also adopted by the Council of Ministers. It included 14 initiatives, among which 4 renewable energy initiatives to promote solar water heaters, to develop wind farms, solar farms, and to promote hydropower as well. And then in 2015, Lebanon's INDC was published, was issued by the government of Lebanon. The government in Lebanon's INDC committed itself to an unconditional target of 15% power and heat in 2030 from renewable energy, and a conditional target of 20% if additional international support is provided. Then in 2016, and after the evaluation of the first National Energy Efficiency Action Plan for Lebanon, a second National Energy Efficiency Action Plan for Lebanon was published by the Lebanese Center for Energy Conservation. It included initiatives for energy efficiency in the different sectors of the economy. And also in 2016, towards the end of the year, the National Renewable Energy Action Plan was developed, was prepared. It includes specific targets for each energy technology application in terms of installed capacity. NREAP, or National Renewable Energy Action Plan, set a clear target towards reaching the 2020 targets. And then in September 2018, Prime Minister Saad Hariri announced that Lebanon will increase its ambitions to 30% renewable energy share in the demand on electricity in 2030. So the same target was confirmed in the updated policy paper for the electricity sector that was published by the Ministry of Energy and Water in March this year, and that was approved by the Council of Ministers and by the Lebanese Parliament. So the target is 30% renewable energy by 2030. Also, the updated policy paper for the electricity sector stresses on the need to advance on all renewable energy projects. And finally, regarding the political commitment, Lebanon, with the help of the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, is developing the renewable energy outlook. It will include the remap and the renewable readiness assessment. And this study, or these two studies, or this one report is expected to be launched at the International Beirut Energy Forum in September 2019. So this is for the political. However, the wheels have started to turn. A lot of renewable energy projects ongoing or on the way, and I will start with the wind projects. Already in February 2018, three power purchase agreements were signed for 3 wind farms with a total installed capacity of 226 megawatts and an expected commercial operation date of February 2021. In the meantime, as well, 28 proposals were shortlisted for solar PV farms. We are now these 28 proposals, and 12 of which will be selected for signature, hopefully, end of 2019. Each PV plant will have a capacity between 10 and 15 megawatt peak, and the total installed capacity will be 180 megawatt in total. So these plants are expected to reach commercial operation in the first quarter of 2021. We also launched last year a call for expressions of interest for a second round wind farms. We received 42 expressions of interest, and we are currently finalizing the request for proposals with a technical assistance funded by the EBRD. This project calls for four projects, 4 companies, each project with a wind farm between 50 megawatts, and then the total installed capacity will be between 200 and 400 megawatts. Also, a second round solar PV is expected to be launched by end of this year. The initial to select 24 proposals, each proposal between megawatt peak, and the total installed capacity will be 300 megawatt peaks. We will see how things will evolve until end of the year, or until the launching of this second round. Now, also last year we published a call for expressions of interest for solar plus storage. We received 75 expressions of interest, and now we are preparing the request for proposals. The current plan is to select 6 offers, 6 proposals, each with a capacity of 100 megawatt peak, no, 50 megawatt peak, 30 and a storage of 35 megawatt and 35 megawatt hours. So the total installed capacity will be 300 megawatt peak solar, and the storage will be 210 megawatts and 210 megawatt hour. So now we are finalizing or preparing the request for proposals also with technical assistance from the EBRD. Finally, we need to mention that a call for expressions of interest for hydropower was also prepared last year, and we received 25 expressions, and an RFP, request for proposals, is also under preparation. Now I'll leave you with my colleague, Dr. Joseph Al-Assad, who will continue from here, mainly to talk about the existing grid or the existing generation fleet, and maybe you'll learn more about the potential for further things. Thank you.
Thank you, Rani. Thank you, Carlos. Sorry for not being there at the beginning of the presentation. It's the regular blackouts in Lebanon.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about those in a second. So thank you, Rani, for setting the background on what's happening on the policy level in terms of, let's say, renewable energy. But allow me to begin, first of all, because we're going to talk a lot about 2030. So we need to define what we will have in 2030. So lately, the Lebanese government has adopted an updated version of its electricity reform paper. And in the updated version of the electricity reform paper, we see that in 2019, we have a gap of 1,200 megawatts of unsatisfied demand in Lebanon that are usually coped with small-scale private diesel generators. So in Lebanon, the demand increase is estimated at 3%, which means that in 2030, according to the plan, we will have a total installed capacity of around 5,700 megawatt with a demand of 4,600 megawatts. Now, if we look at the existing installed capacity, we see that we have CCGTs that constitute 35% of our power plant fleet, steam turbines generators 28%, the power barges constitute 16%, and those are here based on a power rental agreement. The new ICEs that were installed in Zoo and GE 9%, the OCGTs in Baalbek and Sur that are used as peak power plants constitute 5%. Hydro was 4%, and imports from Syria 3%. Now, this is a very important slide from my point of view, because as you may see here, we have the respective installed capacity of each of the power plants correspondingly with the, let's say, generation LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity generation in this case. So if you look at rapidly at all the costs, we see that most of them have cost higher than 10 or 11 US cents per kilowatt hour, which means that most renewable energies in our case are very competitive. And at the same time that the PPA, the wind PPA that Rani talked about, had a very competitive price compared to the current generation. Now, in order to cope for this gap between the generation and the demand, the government is basing its generation plan from 2020 to 2025, and then another power plant in 2029 would be needed because of the natural increase for sure. Now, as for the technology that will be used, the World Bank is helping the Ministry of Energy and Water with a grid impact assessment study in order to see how much we will need in terms of CCGTs, how much steam turbines, and how much ICEs. So the capacities are there, but the technologies may be changing, especially that during the Beirut Energy Forum last year, Lebanon has announced its national target for renewable energies being at 30% into 2030, but also it was also adopted within the electricity reform paper by the Lebanese government. So we're looking at very high shares of renewable energy. But before looking at those shares of renewable energy, if we just look at the following image, which is a frequency reading of the grid in Lebanon in 2015, and we see that the frequency is fluctuating drastically. With such a frequency variations, not only on the lower side where it is going down to 48 and 48.5 hertz, but also on the upper part where we see that it reaches easily 51 hertz and 51.5 hertz. We are in a huge need for frequency regulation in terms of renewable energy. Now, as I've said, the target for 2030 is to have 30% of the electricity consumed in Lebanon coming from renewable energies. Now, we are undergoing the preparation of the renewable energy outlook for Lebanon in collaboration with IRENA, and that will set the different scenarios that are available for us to reach that 30% target. One of the scenarios, draft scenarios, if you want, that were presented during the RRA validation report last month in Beirut was to have 2,700 megawatts of PV, that's the one in purple, 1,500 megawatts of wind in green, around 830 megawatts of hydro, 100 megawatts of CSP with storage, and around 10 to 15 megawatts of biogas. Now, the most interesting part for our presentation today is not all of those. We should be looking especially on comparing the shares of variable renewable energies, and those are the wind and the PV, which has, where, as I said, one of the scenarios is that they will have around 4,200 megawatts of installed capacity compared to conventional or thermal power plants that are having around 4,800 megawatts. So that is a huge penetration on the level of installed capacities for renewable energies, around 45%, and that needs to be handled with extreme care. So we see pretty well that we have a huge need for renewable for electricity storage in the future in Lebanon, especially with the high shares of renewable energies that we are aiming at. Now, but what type of application of storage are we talking about? If I go back to the slide and we look at the year 2030, we see that approximately we have 1,000 megawatts of spinning reserves that we will need. And those are not only spinning reserves, because in fact, this is the load demand curve for Lebanon for the last year on a monthly basis. If we look at this, we see that we have a seasonal variation between August and November, which are the lowest demanding months and the most demanding months. We see approximately that if we look at each month, the difference between them, it's fluctuating around 1,400 megawatts. So the seasonal fluctuation is around 1,400 megawatts. So meaning in November, for example, we will need around 1,600 megawatts less than what we need in August. Now, if another point of view that is very interesting here, just to clarify, this means that the previous idea means that we will need to invest 1,600 megawatts more to satisfy the need in December than it is in August or November. So in this case, if we look also on, this is the average day in August. So if we look at the average day in August, we see that in order to cover that demand, we need around 4,550 megawatts, which is satisfied by the current plan. Now, the peak demand is around 4,300 megawatts, so this leaves us with a 200 megawatt unit of spinning reserve, which is within the international standards. But if we look at the difference between the day and the night, we see that we have around 1,100 megawatts. If you can see, the lowest is around 6 a.m., which is a little bit less than 3,300 megawatts, and the highest is around 21 p.m., which is around 4,400 megawatts, leaving us with a gap of 1,100 megawatts. Now, what if the scenario, if we decrease our conventional power plants by one power plant of 550 megawatts. This will leave us with extra generation during the night of around 4,500 megawatts, and leave us with a need of around 4,000 megawatts during the day. So this gives us a huge potential for electricity storage before getting into renewable energies even, based on conventional power plants, where excess electricity will be stored during the night and used during the day. Now, it is very important to look at the cycling of the demand curve in Lebanon, where you can see this is November, and those are the different days of November. We see that we have a very good cycling rate between the night and the day, where the demand increases, as I've said, during the day by around 1,400 or 1,500 megawatts during the day than it is during the night, and it is pretty cycled. So if batteries are there, we will be able to charge them each night. Now, if we bring renewables to the game, and here we're talking about, we're basing on the scenario that I have presented earlier on, based on the renewable energy outlook, we see that here we will have a huge excess of electricity compared to the demand. If we consider all the electricity power plants, conventional power plants being installed in 2030. Now, if we look at it from a different point of view, and the most important part is the blue is the hydro, the purple is the conventional, and the green is PV and wind. So I want you to look with me if we consider it the scenario where we will have a 600 megawatt of storage over 6 hours. So here we see that we have a huge excess of electricity that was produced between, let's say, 12 and 6 p.m. And then we have a deficit between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. But if we consider 600 megawatt storage over 6 hours, this will help us satisfy the needs during night without having inquiry or requiring an extra power plant. So all this will be helping us in saving investment on the thermal power plant. Now, if we look at a more critical case where demand is higher, like the one in August, which is peak demand in Lebanon. So we see that in this case, the gap between the demand and the generation is even higher during the night. And again, here, if we will be able to have a 600 megawatt storage system over 6 hours, we will be able to do a generation shifting in order to satisfy the load during the night without needing to turn on another power plant of the conventional power plants. So another potential application, here I've based on the BRSS, Beirut River Solar Snake data that we have received during February this year. We've built a couple of generation profile of solar generation profile of the 300 megawatt power plant we are, Rani talked about where the RFP is under preparation. We see that, for example, on the 24th of February, we had a very nice smooth curve that was generating. However, if we look at, for example, the day just before, on the 23rd of February, we see that in around, let's say, we've lost around 423 megawatts in less than 8 minutes of generation, leaving us with a huge amount of lost PV in terms of power output fluctuation. So here again, we see that we have a very good potential for electricity storage in order to stabilize the output of the power plants, especially keeping in mind the frequency readings I've showed you in the beginning of the presentation. So the main idea in conclusion, if you want, is that essentially that we have not only a big potential for energy storage, but also we have a huge need for energy storage in Lebanon for frequency regulation purposes on the short term, for load shifting on the longer term, and for power plant output regulation, looking at the 30% target in 2030. So what have been also concluded from this presentation and this small study that we have done is that it will have not only a very positive impact stabilizing variable renewable energies, but also it will have a very positive impact on the needed investment for new power plants, for new conventional power plants, whereas seen adding electricity storage will help us reduce the needed power plants by one power plant. So all you have to do now is to stay tuned and wait for the upcoming bids that will be launching. So thank you very much, and to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your presentation, and Rani. And it's I can see why there is a need for energy storage in if you're going to have more variable renewables. But we'll get to that later. I can see that we have a number of questions on the Q&A box, and one of them is what will be the levelized cost of energy of PV and wind projects per megawatt hour? So what costs are you expecting? And I see Joseph has has raised his hand to answer these questions. So Joseph, over to you.
I was answering it, in fact, in the Q&A box. All bids are based on a competitive basis, so we do not have a preset LCOE cost. But from what we are seeing in the current market, and from what the whispers we are hearing, if you want, we're talking about around 6.57 cents per kilowatt hours, and depends really on the size and on the type of application, because not all the 2,700 megawatts of solar PV are going to be centralized large scale. We have a huge potential of small scale decentralized PV, and for that we will have a big surprise really soon in Lebanon.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we have a question, which is actually one of the questions I was asking. So what kind of storage technologies are you considering in Lebanon? So I don't know.
I'm going to take this one. Okay, I was waiting for you to take it. Yeah.
So we are considering different options. We are considering thermal storage. Now we are studying the potential for concentrated solar power in certain areas in Lebanon. We are also studying the possibility of having some hydro storage, pump storage. It may need some rethinking of our existing hydropower plants and our plans for hydropower, but it's also one possibility. And on the shorter term, we are considering battery energy storage.
Okay, thank you very much, Rani. And another question which ties in, I think is interesting. So how do you manage voltage and frequency regulation now?
In fact, I will take that one. Frequency and voltage regulation are managed through load shading. So that's why I was not able to connect at the beginning of the presentation. That was a live answer, if you want. So usually when the frequency is varying, in order to stabilize the frequency, the control center at EDL will begin by shaving loads on a predefined, let's say, priority criteria that they have. So each line of them they will begin cutting off loads one after the other in order to regulate the frequency, or they will increase generation in the rare situation where it is possible to increase generation.
Okay, thank you very much. So that answers that question. And then there is a question from Manuel Quero. He's asking he says, "Dear Joseph, thanks for your interesting presentation. I would like to know if the demand for storage will be covered all with batteries or CSP is considered in the future beyond 100 megawatts. What tenders would be announced?" So I think you have partially answered this question in terms of the technologies, but when will the tenders be announced?
In fact, the CSP tender will be announced really soon, and on that, Rani can complement. I think he can give a more accurate answer. But for the type of storage, even with CSP, we are considering those. The 100 megawatts are in fact two power plants of 50 megawatts each with 7.5 hours of storage. But as I mentioned earlier on, that was one of the scenarios that are being considered for 2030. And for the final scenarios that will be adopted, you will have to wait for the International Beirut Energy Forum for the launching of the Renewable Energy Outlook for 2030. Now, for the timing of the bid, I think Rani can add something.
Yes, I will add that with the help of the World Bank, the MENA CSP KIP project, we have installed measurement equipment to assess, at least to initiate the assessment of the CSP potential in Lebanon. And now soon we will be launching the feasibility study for CSP in Lebanon, which will heavily be dependent on the results of the measurement campaign that we are currently performing. After we finalize or have an initial idea on the feasibility of CSP, we may certainly update our 100 megawatt number or target, and the tenders will be also done in parallel.
Okay. So Rani, when do you expect that you will get results from your measurement campaign?
I think we will need around 1 year of measurement, and in parallel we can start with the feasibility study and finalize it shortly afterwards. So I expect that within a year or so mid 2020 towards fall 2020 we would launch the tenders.
Okay. And if they say something you can share, so what kind of measurements are being undertaken? Are they being undertaken with meteorological stations on the ground, or are you relying on satellite data?
No, two meteorological stations were installed in two areas in Lebanon.
Okay. Well, that's good news, because that's a lot more accurate than satellite measurements. So, one question I have actually is I noticed in your presentation, Rani, that you had various plants that were in one of the tenders. You were choosing plants between 10 and 15 megawatts. So, what's the rationale behind choosing that size range?
Okay, we have different reasons for this. The first one is that these plants could be connected to the medium voltage network. So we are connecting them, or we expect them to be connected on the 66 kilovolt substations, so 66 to 15 kilovolt substations. Mm-hmm. This is for the first most important reason. The other one is to have them dispersed around the country. So we are aiming to have 3 plants per region. This way we can have solar everywhere. Everyone can everyone can identify to a solar plant nearby, which would have a good awareness raising also impact, and also and development impact as well. And the third one is also due to land availability in some areas. This way, we would make sure that 10 or 15 megawatt plants, the land needed for these plants would be easier to acquire than land needed for larger plants, especially that these are led by the private sector. So and the land will be identified and leased by the private sector. So we are not offering any public land for these projects, and for private sector, for the private sector, it's easier to find smaller pieces of land.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that I was curious, and those are very good reasons. But now the trend seems to be for larger and larger plants. So I thought, well, there must be a reason behind the choosing the smaller sized plants. One of the there is an interesting question here actually, which is has to do more with regulatory frameworks. So P. Karam asks, is there a regulatory framework in place to import all the equipment needed to build the plants that you want to tender? And see, Joseph has raised his hand again. So Joseph, please.
So in fact, we do not need a regulatory framework to import the equipment. But what is in place even is a regulatory framework to have lower fees on taxation in terms of import of equipment related to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And to that, I'm referring to Article 20 of Law 444. That was we had the execution decrees last year for it in Lebanon, and it will allow us to import renewable energy equipment even at lower import fees and to get them into Lebanon.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, for your answer. And then another question for you, Joseph, is why we see that you consider hydro and conventional as base load. Why don't you use hydro as your storage and shift generation from hydro during the night when PV is available during the day?
In fact, it was just for the presentation, if you want presentation purposes that I put it like that. But this is how we are using hydro right now. And the main problem is that another question, interesting question, I've seen that the Soglia study that was done in 2012 to assess the potential of hydro has estimated a total potential of around 800 to 900 megawatts of existing potential in Lebanon for hydro. But the energy output of these are varying drastically between 1 year and the other. So for the same installed capacity, if I may remember well, back in 2010, it was the equivalent of 6%. If you look now in 2018, it's around 4 to 5%. So we see the fluctuation of the hydro output because of rainfall for sure. And next year we'll be looking at a very, I think, a very good hydro year, as we will be looking at high shares of hydro production. So for the short-term regulation, for sure, hydro will be used for load shifting between night and day.
Okay, thank you. So when you mentioned that there is around 800 megawatts of potential of hydro capacity in Lebanon, is that of installed capacity right now, or does that include the unused capacity that you haven't developed yet?
No, in fact, that's the right now we have a nameplate installation of 282 megawatts of hydro. They are lacking a lot of maintenance, so they are producing last year. It was the equivalent of 170 something megawatts. in terms of efficiency. But we are looking at an extra 600 to 700 megawatt potential available in Lebanon that is financially feasible.
Okay, thank you very much. And Rani, there is a question here for you. So what are the plans for solar PV rooftop power plants?
Yes, we have several initiatives regarding solar PV rooftop plans. First, in the National Renewable Energy Action Plan, we have set a clear target for rooftop or for decentralized PV. Now, in the remap study for Lebanon that is being prepared by jointly with IRENA, it includes specific target for rooftop PV. As for the policies, currently every private sector entity can benefit from loans with a very attractive interest rate for solar PV for the own consumption of the facility. Second, for the public sector, the Ministry of Energy and Water has financed a project to install 10 solar PV systems in 10 public buildings, and we hope that this would be extended soon once all these 10 projects are finalized. The third thing, the electricity utility launched in December 2010 the net metering scheme. So now since almost 10 years ago, PV systems could connect to the grid, and there are current works on having a law for the connection of decentralized solar PV systems on the grid. So not just the net metering scheme that is currently being done.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are quite a few initiatives to do with decentralized power and rooftop power as well. Does that respond to, suppose a lot of the power that is being generated now in other markets is meant to feed into the grid as large-scale projects? Is there a land availability constraint that's one of that's I suppose getting you to develop also distributed energy?
So I will and I think I answered this a bit. So of course, land availability is an issue. Also, the grid capacity is another issue. So it's always easier in Lebanon to implement smaller projects than larger projects.
Okay. Thank you, Rani. There is a question here. That someone asked. So, what are the short-term government plans to provide electricity 24 hours a day, and what's the time scale for that? That's from Rami Tarabai, so who I believe is must be based in Lebanon as well.
Also, it's not the main topic of the presentation, but the updated electricity reform paper mentioned that in 2020 we will be looking at a very good amelioration of electricity supply, hopefully reaching 24 hours of electricity in 2020.
I would like to add or invite Rami to download the updated policy paper for the electricity sector from the website of the Ministry of Energy and Water. So the plan is available, and everyone can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. And there is another question which I think is important for developers of PV or any renewable energy project in Lebanon is how accessible is the transmission and distribution network information in Lebanon? Is this information publicly available?
In fact, EDL has on its website. I will type the link for him. EDL website. They have if you want the diagram of the electricity network, the transmission and especially the transmission network, distribution network is not very available. But in all cases, this is considered as a national and somehow classified data when it comes to the GPS location of each of these power plants. So we have the approach where the general plan that shows where the main substations are, and usually what developers are doing is that when they identify the land, they will go to the plant to identify the nearest power plant, and then they will go on the ground in order to study the potential for connecting to that power plant.
Okay, right. And there is another question for you, Joseph, which is from an anonymous viewer, which says, where do we stand today in terms of the NREAP and the NEEAP targets? Can we have a percentages reached so far? When do you expect that the NEEA loans to be available again after being freezed? Are you currently working on new incentives for new energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies? So this person is cheating because he's asked 4 questions instead of one.
Exactly. Exactly. I will begin by answering one after the other. As for the targets of the NREAP, in 2020, we will be looking hopefully at overachieving that target of 12%. With the current PPA of wind that was signed, with hopefully because we were delayed by a political situation in Lebanon with the lack of government, but hopefully we will be able to still meet the target of 2020 and overachieve it with the current existing bids that are in the pipeline. So with the 180 megawatt of PV, with the PPA that for the wind that was signed, and with a very good year of hydro in 2020, we will be able to overachieve the target, hopefully. Now, for the second question, NERIA was never freezed, and Rani talked about NERIA. Some of the banks are taking more time than other commercial banks. That's not up to the ministry or to the LCEC. So if anyone is having a problem with their NERIA loans, they can switch, they can change their commercial banks. And NERIA is a financing mechanism that adopted by the Ministry of Energy and Water, LCEC, and the Central Bank of Lebanon, offering low interest rates for PV installations. Now, what was the third question? In fact, the one that is also interesting, if it is the same user, is the new initiatives. Yes, we can link them together. In fact, as Rani mentioned, but he did not go into the details, we are working on a new law for power wheeling, net metering, and peer-to-peer electricity exchange. So I think that will be the next big initiatives in Lebanon related to renewable energy. So that will open the door towards power wheeling, not as in Jordan. We are learning from the experience of our, let's say, fellow Arab colleagues, and we are trying to adapt it to the Lebanese situation. So hopefully we will be having really soon a law that will open the way for power wheeling, for off-site net metering, for several schemes outside the traditional net metering that is being adopted in Lebanon.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And there's a question which I think ties in quite nicely for Rani. So what do you think, Rani, about the feasibility of combining solar PV and CSP? So what are your thoughts on that?
So we will have to wait for the feasibility study and see what are the results. It could be it is a very interesting option. I think it's very feasible, very attractive for Lebanon, but we will have to see the results of the study that will identify the best option given the available resources.
Right, and then the same person asked whether there is any chance that if you implement storage technologies effectively, whether you could do with the 5 thermal power plants instead of the 6 approved. Any
Yes,
thoughts on that?
when the Council of Ministers or the Parliament approves a plan or a strategy, it's just to facilitate its implementation, and then the implementation of each plant or of a project or another will be based on the needs. Then whenever whatever is the need, the plan will follow. At least we have the approval now, and we will see how things will go depending on the need or the evolution of the needs.
Okay, so it's not set in stone what's been approved. It's just indicative that it should go ahead, but it obviously depends on whether there is demand and need for those power plants. Right, okay. So although there are 19 questions here, actually, I think we have answered most of them because some of them actually are repeated quite a lot. So there is one here actually that looks interesting. So for Joseph Al-Assad, so looking at the graphs you have shown, we see that you consider hydrogen convention. I know we have responded, we have answered that. So yeah, I think we have answered most of the questions. So is there any, is there anything that you would like to tell your audience as parting words?
My parting words are the following. So we have a clear political commitment. We have projects that already started. Obviously, the potential is there, the need is there. The market will be there or has already started and will grow in the next few years. So we invite you all to stay tuned to the energy market in Lebanon and to look for a role in this market.
Thank you very much, Rani. Joseph, what would you like to say to the audience?
In fact, I would like to thank all the audience for all of their very interesting questions. I will try to answer all of them. For the ones that we did not answer by writing later on. But I think Rani concluded pretty well by saying that I think in the near future and the very near future, as Lebanon has set a first by launching the 300 megawatt PV with 70 megawatt hours of storage for each of them, the 3 PV farms. It was one of the largest known for the moment in the world. We will also be launching another one from the same scale. So keep looking, keep an eye on the energy market in Lebanon, keep an eye on the renewable energy market in Lebanon, and keep faith in those two markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. So, well, I'd like to thank both our speakers for being here and our audience for tuning into our webinar today. Go to in our website, atainsights.com. You can see a lot more webinars that you could where you could learn about renewable energy. All our webinars are free to attend. So I hope to see you in more of them. And thank you very much. And I really hope to see you again. Have a great day.